There are places in this world where history whispers its darkest secrets, where the very soil holds the echoes of untold suffering. One such place lies hidden in Natchez, Mississippi, a place so inauspicious, so haunting, that even the trees refuse to forget. It is the Devil's Punch Bowl, but this isn't just a name. It's a graveyard, a mass grave where thousands of newly freed black men, women, and children were left to die by the very people who had sworn to protect them. Let's retrogress. The year was 1863. The Civil War was tearing America apart, but for enslaved black people in the South, the winds of change carried a new kind of hope. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. Freedom was finally within reach, and so tens of thousands of enslaved people ran and fled from plantations, escaping the horrors of slavery in search of freedom. And where did they go? To the Union Army, to the soldiers who had come to set them free. But what these freedmen and women didn't know was that their nightmare had only just begun. Natchez, Mississippi became one of the largest assembling points for freed slaves. The Union Army had taken control of the city, and thousands of black families trooped in, believing they had found safety. But instead of food, shelter, and protection, they found something else, something worse than the bondage they had just escaped. The Union didn't see them as people, they saw them as a problem. And so the Union devised a means, a place to contain this problem. A deep, unforgiving ravine, a natural prison where there was no escape, the Devil's Punch Bowl. They bundled thousands of freed black people into this place. No food, no water, no medical care, no way out. And then they locked the gates. What happened next was beyond evil. Starvation, disease, death. Thousands perished. Entire families wiped out in the shadow of a war that was supposed to free them. The smell of decay filled the air. Bodies were left to rot. The Mississippi River carried away the forgotten. And yet, history barely spoke about it. Why? Why has this story been buried? Why has the world forgotten? Perhaps because the truth is too damning. Perhaps because it reveals a side of history no one wants to admit. In this video, we'll expose what was meant to be left in TJA dark. Beyond being a story of suffering, this is one of betrayal, of cruelty disguised as liberation, of thousands of innocent lives erased. This is the untold truth of the Devil's Punch Bowl. 1865. The air smelled of gunpowder and decay. Cities lay in ruins, battlefields were littered with the dead, and the echoes of cannon fire still rang in the ears of those who had survived. The Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history, was coming to an end. The Confederacy was collapsing. Its dream of a slave-holding empire collapsed. But for the 4 million black souls who had endured generations of bondage, this wasn't just the end of a war, it was the beginning of something unknown. Freedom was a word many had only dared to whisper in the darkness of plantation quarters, a dream passed down in quiet voices through centuries of suffering. At last it arrived, or so they thought. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it sent shockwaves across the South. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate states were now free. But words on paper did not break the chains, nor did they erase the violence of centuries overnight. Enslaved people knew this all too well. Many remained in bondage by their so-called masters who refused to embrace the proclamation. Others risked everything, running from the plantations in the dead of night, desperate to find the Union Army, their supposed liberators. They believed salvation awaited them behind the Union lines. But freedom, as they soon discovered, came at a high cost. The Union Army, though sworn to defeat the Confederacy, was not always the friend that black people had imagined. And this betrayal was more apparent in the city of Natchez, Mississippi. As Confederate strongholds fell, the roads became flooded with the footsteps of thousands. Black men, women, and children, barefoot, hungry, and exhausted, made their way to Union-controlled areas, seeking for protection. Natchez became one of the largest assembling areas for freed slaves. It now stood under Union control, once a hub of the Cotton Empire. To those seeking refuge, it seemed like a promised land. But promises are fragile things. And for the thousands who arrived in Natchez, their hope quickly turned to horror. The Union soldiers that were stationed in Natchez were unprepared and unwilling to care for the massive influx of freed people. Many of these soldiers, despite fighting against the Confederacy, held their personal beef against black people. They saw the refugees as a burden rather than fellow humans, an unwanted problem they did not wish to solve. There was no warm welcome, no shelter, no food waiting for them. Instead, they were herded like cattle into makeshift camps, where they were given nothing more than empty promises and orders to stay put. The soldiers did not see them as citizens or even as people worthy of dignity. They were simply numbers, disposable and unwanted. The conditions in these camps were nothing short of inhumane. Families were packed together in extremely dirty tents. Food was scarce. The little that was given to them was often rotten or infested with insects. Water, if available at all, was contaminated, spreading disease like wildfire. And worst of all, there was no escape. Many tried to leave to seek better lives elsewhere, but Union soldiers stood at the camp's edges with rifles in hand, making it clear this was not a place of refuge. It was a prison. But the cruelty did not end with neglect. The same Union Army that had freed them now sought to use them. Freed black men were forced into hard labor like building roads, digging trenches, hauling supplies, work that was no different from the slavery they had just fled. Women and children, too weak to labor, were left to rot in disease-ridden tents, slowly wasting away under the scorching Mississippi sun. And for those who resisted, the punishment was immediate and severe. Some were beaten, others were shot. The Union may have won the war, but the battle for black survival had only just begun. Imagine fleeing from one master, only to find yourself at the mercy of another. Imagine risking your life for the pursuit of freedom, only to realize that freedom was just another torture. This was the reality for the thousands of freedmen and women who arrived in Natchez. What makes this story even more sad is that only few made it out alive. The camps became death traps. Disease claimed thousands. Starvation took thousands more. The Devil's Punch Bowl was already forming, and soon, it became one of the largest unmarked graves in American history. And yet, history chose to forget them. No memorials stand in their honor. No textbooks tell their story, their suffering, their deaths, erased from history, as if their lives never mattered at all. But this video is one of remembrance, one that uncovers what was buried. Because what happened in Natchez, Mississippi in 1863 was beyond evil, and the full story is only just beginning. Imagine being in the shoes of those who escaped a lifetime of brutality, only to run straight into the cave of death just because you were told you were free, that the war had ended, that a new life awaited you. But the moment you arrived, you realized something was terribly wrong. The Devil's Punch Bowl wasn't a refuge. It was a trap, a pit of suffering sealed off from the world, where hope died alongside the people who entered it. This is what happened to over 20,000 freed black men, women, and children in Natchez, Mississippi. They thought they had finally broken free from the chains of slavery, but instead, they found themselves imprisoned once again. This time, by those who ought to protect them. But how did this happen? How did a place meant for safety turn into one of the most horrific mass death locations in American history? First of all, let's look at the geographic location. Beyond a name, the Devil's Punch Bowl is a place, a deep, bowl-shaped ravine, surrounded by high bluffs and thick wilderness. From above, it looks like nature's own prison, a pit carved into the Mississippi landscape, impossible to climb out of. And this is where the Union Army forced tens of thousands of freed black people to stay, not in proper shelters, but inside this death trap, a place no human being should ever have been left to die. When they first arrived, the freed men and women were filled with hope. They had faith that the Union soldiers, the very people who had fought against the Confederacy, would protect them. But that was their first mistake. Unknown to them that they were not citizens, they were not survivors. They were simply a nuisance, a burden, a problem that needed to be taken care of. And so the Union Army did what governments have done to unwanted people throughout history. They built a camp, a forced encampment at the bottom of the Devil's Punch Bowl, surrounded by cliffs so steep and treacherous that escape was nearly impossible. There were no roads, no supplies, no resources. The only thing these people had was each other and their lives that would soon be gone. Hunger gripped the people first. No food, no crops, nothing to sustain the thousands of men, women, and children who were trapped in the pit. They desperately consumed anything edible, roots, insects, even tree bark, but the human body has a limit to how much it can endure. And soon, starvation began. The heat and humidity turned the ravine into a breeding ground for death. Families huddled together, trying to comfort the sick, trying to save their children. Mothers wrapped their starving babies, watching helplessly as their little bodies wasted away. Fathers who had survived the horrors of slavery wept as they buried their wives in shallow graves, knowing they would soon join them. And the children who had been born into captivity never knew true freedom. They died with their eyes still open, waiting for a rescue that never came. By the time the first mass graves were dug, the Union soldiers barely took notice. Some reports claim that thousands of bodies were left to decompose where they had fallen. Their remains faded into the soil of the ravine. Others say that when the Mississippi River flooded, it carried away the corpses, erasing the evidence of their suffering. But the evidence isn't gone. The land still remembers. The fruit trees that grow in the Devil's Punch Bowl today were said to be nourished by the bodies beneath the earth. And the people of Natchez still tell the stories. Stories of bones rising to the surface after heavy rains. Stories of whispers carried on the wind at night. Stories of a history that refuses to be buried. The Union never built a monument for these victims. The government never issued an apology. There are no memorials, no history books, no school lessons that taught what truly happened there. And why? Because the truth is hard to bear. Because acknowledging this tragedy meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that even in so-called freedom, Black lives were still considered disposable. This was not war. This was not collateral damage. This was deliberate neglect. This was genocide. And yet, few people know this story. Some people have never heard the name Devil's Punch Bowl. It has been erased, just like the people who died there. But erasing history doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the screams, the suffering, the thousands of lives lost in that pit of death. So today we remember. We speak their names, even if history says otherwise. Because the Devil's Punch Bowl is more than just a place. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when a nation turns its back on its most vulnerable population, and a testament to the resilience of those who suffered in silence. This is one of the greatest betrayals in American history. This freed individuals had believed in the promise of the Union, in the words of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, in the idea that the soldiers they saw marching through the South had come to deliver them to freedom. But freedom was only a lie. Many white Union soldiers, despite fighting to defeat the Confederacy, had the same deep racial prejudices as their enemies. And so, when tens of thousands of black refugees flooded into Union-controlled Natchez, the response was not one of protection or care, it was one of contempt. The Union saw these freed black people as burdens instead of survivors, as a problem that needed a solution. And in their eyes, the Devil's Punch Bowl was the solution. Think for a moment, thousands of freedmen exhausted from their escape, their bodies thin from starvation, their children clutching at their sides, hopeful, desperate, looking up at the Union soldiers in blue. They were told to follow them, they were promised protection, and so they obeyed. They followed them past the city limits of Natchez, past the homes of white landowners, past the busy streets, down into the deep wooded ravine of the Punch Bowl. Once they arrived, the truth became clear that they were never meant to leave. Union soldiers even blocked all escape routes with walls. The freedmen were trapped, hungry, and full of thirst. They were not given medical attention. What they were given was death, while they were eating leaves, tree bark. The weak became weaker, their ribs pressing through their skin, their eyes sunken and lifeless. And all the while, the Union Army stood glad watching. But starvation wasn't the only enemy. In the suffocating heat of the Mississippi wilderness, disease spread like wildfire. The conditions were inhumane. There were no coffins, no funerals, no final prayers, only the stench of death. The people who had survived the whips of slavery, who had endured the brutal escape, who had clung to the dream of freedom, were discarded like waste.
And as the days turned into weeks, as the bodies rotted in the humid southern air, the Union Army continued to stand by, unmoved, uncaring, watching as their solution unfolded exactly as they intended. But here is the question we must ask. Why? Why didn't the Union step in? Why didn't they send help? After all, wasn't this the army that had fought to end slavery? Wasn't this the army that had marched through the South, breaking chains and promising a new future? How could they look into the hollow, desperate eyes of these freedmen and do nothing?
The truth is far darker than we were ever taught. The reality is that the Union Army never saw black people as equals. Even among those who fought against the Confederacy, there was a belief that African Americans were inferior. They did not fight to end slavery out of love or justice. They fought to preserve the Union, and for many, that meant keeping black people out of the American future. Many Union generals believed freed slaves were nothing more than contraband property, a drain on resources, an inconvenience that stood in the way of rebuilding the South. Some officers even admitted that allowing them to die was a natural solution to the so-called black problem. These were the very men who held the power to help, but they chose not to. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this tragedy is how it was covered up. The story of the Devil's Punch Bowl was not taught. It was not written in textbooks. It was not spoken of in classrooms. It was erased. Why? Because it exposes a truth that America never wanted to confront. That even after the chains were broken, black lives were still disposable. Historians who dared to research this event found their work ignored or dismissed. Official records of the number of deaths are conveniently missing. No Union reports, no government acknowledgement, just silence. And so, the thousands who perished in the Devil's Punch Bowl remain nameless, their bodies buried beneath the soil, their stories suffocated beneath every second that flies. But today, we speak their names. Today, we expose what was buried. Today, we refuse to let history erase the truth. Because what happened in 1863 was more than just a tragedy. It was a genocide committed by their so-called protectors. And so we ask, how many more stories like this have been buried? How many more truths have been erased? If this could happen to thousands right under the nose of history, what else have we never been told? The effect of Devil's Punch Bowl can still be felt now. The trees sway gently in the Mississippi breeze, their roots sinking deep into the earth where thousands of souls were left to rot. To an unsuspecting visitor, it might seem like nothing more than a picturesque landscape, a forgotten extension of land in Natchez. But beneath the soil, beneath the overgrown brush and tangled roots is something far more horrifying. This land is cursed, not by superstition, but by history. By the time the Union Army abandoned the Devil's Punch Bowl, the damage had already been done. The thousands of freed black men, women, and children who had been imprisoned here, left to die of starvation, disease, and neglect, were no longer counted among the living. The ones who could still stand, those who still had breath in their bodies, stumbled away from that place, never daring to return. But for the dead, there was nowhere else to go than the land of the dead. The Union Army never buried them. They didn't mark their graves. They didn't offer a single word of remembrance. Instead, the bodies were discarded, shoved into mass graves, dumped into the Mississippi River, or simply left where they fell. The stench of death hung over the land like a plague, a grim testament to the horrors that had unfolded. But soon, nature did what history tried to erase. The bodies disappeared beneath the earth, swallowed whole by the ravine. For decades, people stumbled upon human remains in the area, skull fragments, bits of bone peeking through the soil. Even today, locals whisper about the lost souls of the Punch Bowl. They say the land itself remembers. That on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint cries of the forgotten souls. Some say the trees know the truth, that their roots grew deeper, nourished by the blood of the dead. Peach trees sprouted in the area, their fruit ripe and full. But the people of Natchez refuse to eat them. They say the peaches taste of death, that the soil is too tainted, too cursed to bear anything pure. But this wasn't just a natural disaster. It wasn't a plague that wiped out those thousands of freed black men and women. It was intentional. It was planned. And perhaps that's why the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl has been buried, because acknowledging it would mean admitting an unforgivable truth. One former Union soldier, years after the war, spoke of the horrors he had witnessed. He described the camps, if they could even be called that. He told of men, their ribs protruding through thin layers of skin, collapsing in the dirt from hunger. Women with sunken faces clutching their lifeless children, rocking them as if they could somehow will them back to life. He spoke of the thousands who had died, and the silence that followed. He tried to tell his story, to warn the others of what was happening. But the Union soldiers silenced him. They called him a liar, said he was in an unstable mental state. And when he disappeared days later, no one asked any questions. And what about the locals? Those who lived near the Devil's Punch Bowl during and after the war? Many of them refused to speak of what they saw. Fear kept their lips sealed. Fear that the truth would come with unbearable consequences. Fear that if they dared to speak out, they too would vanish into that cursed ravine. Even today, some residents of Natchez will tell you that when the rains come, when the Mississippi swells and the soil loosens, bones still rise from the earth. The past refuses to stay buried. But here's the real question. Why does no one talk about the Devil's Punch Bowl? Why isn't this story told in classrooms, printed in textbooks, acknowledged in historical records? The answer is as disturbing as the event itself, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that even in their so-called freedom, black people were still disposable. The Union was supposed to be the savior, the side that fought against slavery, the side that freed the enslaved. But how do you explain what happened at the Devil's Punch Bowl? How can you justify letting thousands of freed black people die in a forgotten ravine? You can't. You erase it. You bury it deeper than the bodies themselves. You let time and silence do what history cannot. But history doesn't forget. The land doesn't forget. The people don't forget. And now, neither do you. Today, the Devil's Punch Bowl remains a quiet place. There are no monuments, no memorials, no plaques to mark the thousands who perished there. Just trees, just silence, just the whispers of a past too dark to acknowledge. But if you ever find yourself there, if you stand at the edge of that forgotten graveyard and listen closely, you might just hear them. The echoes of the lost, the voices of the abandoned, the ghosts of the Devil's Punch Bowl. The past never truly dies. It lingers in the air, it settles in the ground, it whispers in the wind. Some places hold the weight of history so heavily that even nature refuses to forget. The Devil's Punch Bowl is one of those places. The earth itself seems to bear the scars of what happened there. The land, steeped in sorrow, has never healed. And maybe it never will. Today, the Devil's Punch Bowl sits quietly in Natchez, Mississippi. To those who don't know, it looks like nothing more than a deep natural ravine surrounded by thick trees and wild vegetation. But the locals know better. They know this is not just a valley. This is a graveyard. A graveyard with no tombstones, no names, no official records. Only the bones buried beneath the soil can tell the story. And even now, over a century and a half later, they are still there. Something strange happens there. Something eerie. The soil of the Devil's Punch Bowl is rich, fresh, and fertile, but not for everything. Wild peach trees grow across the ravine, their branches heavy with fruit, but the locals won't eat them. They refuse. Because these trees, they say, are nourished by the bodies buried beneath. They call them the root of death. The blood of our ancestors runs through those roots, one local once said. No man should eat from the tree that grew from suffering. And so, the peaches rot where they fall untouched, left as an eerie offering to the souls trapped beneath the earth. It's as if nature itself is trying to remind the world of what happened here, refusing to let the past slip away. But the fruit trees aren't the only thing keeping the past alive. Many who visit the Devil's Punch Bowl report an unsettling feeling, a heavy presence pressing against their chest as if the very air is mourning. Some say the wind carries voices, soft, distant cries echoing through the ravine when the night falls. There are stories of shadowy figures moving between the trees, flickering in and out of sight. Some say they've seen women in tattered clothes standing just beyond the branches, their faces hidden in the dark. Others claim to have heard children laughing, a sound that starts out playful, but quickly turns into a wail of despair. One former local, a man in his 70s, recalled how his grandmother used to warn him about wandering too close to the ravine. She told him that when she was a child, she saw something. A woman, barely more than a shadow, standing among the trees. She was crying, the old man said. But when I blinked, she was gone. The ghosts of the Devil's Punch Bowl aren't just whispers in the wind. They are real. They are buried beneath our feet. Thousands of men, women, and children who once dreamed of freedom, who ran from slavery believing they had finally found safety, only to be locked away and left to die. Their bodies were discarded without ceremony, without dignity. Their names were never recorded. Their stories were never told. And today, there are still no official markers, no memorials, no museums dedicated to their suffering. It is as if the world decided to forget, but the land remembers. How could something so horrific, something so massive, be forgotten? How could thousands of people be buried in unmarked graves, and the world simply moved on like nothing happened? The answer is uncomfortable, because the truth is, history is written by those who have the power to erase what they don't want remembered. The United States government never officially acknowledged what happened at the Devil's Punch Bowl. There were no reparations, no investigations, no justice. In the textbooks, in the classrooms, in the history lessons taught to generations of students, this chapter was simply skipped. And why? Because it was easier to let it be forgotten. And even after the so-called freedom of black people, the oppression never stopped. It wasn't just the Confederate South that harmed black people. The Union, the so-called liberators, played their part in the suffering too. That is a truth many don't want to embrace. But there are those who refuse to let the Devil's Punch Bowl be erased. Historians, activists, and descendants of those who perished here have worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Oral histories have been collected, historical records have been examined, and slowly, the world is starting to listen. In recent years, local groups have pushed for memorials to be placed at the site, demanding that the victims be honored. Some have compared the Devil's Punch Bowl to other massacres, like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 or the Rosewood Massacre of 1923 events that were also buried by history, only to be uncovered decades later. The truth cannot stay hidden forever. No matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how many generations pass, history always finds a way to rise back to the surface. And when it does, we must be willing to face it heads-on. The Devil's Punch Bowl is a symbol of what happens when history is ignored. A reminder that even after slavery was abolished, the war against black people never truly ended. And that war was not always fought with whips and chains. Sometimes it was fought with neglect, with starvation, with mass graves covered in silence. Today the trees still grow, the river still flows, the land still holds its secrets. But now, you know the truth. And it is up to us to make sure it is never forgotten again.